Sections. The sun was setting over the Texas borderlands when Thomas Garrett rode into the small trading post at the edge of nowhere, the kind of settlement that existed only because two trails happened to cross, and men needed water. The light was the color of old copper, casting long shadows across the dusty street, and the wind carried the smell of creosote and distant rain that would never arrive. Thomas dismounted slowly, his joints stiff from a day in the saddle, and tied his horse to the rail outside the general store. He was a man in his late 30s, broad across the shoulders, with hands that bore the permanent stains of labor and a face weathered by sun and silence. He had come to town for supplies, nothing more. Salt, coffee, lamp oil, the essentials that kept a man alive on a hardscrabble ranch 20 miles from the nearest neighbor. Sections inside the store, the air was thick with the smell of tobacco and leather. Thomas moved through the narrow aisles with the economy of someone who knew exactly what he needed and had no interest in conversation. The storekeeper nodded at him without speaking. Thomas had been coming here for 5 years, ever since he'd claimed the land his father left him, and in all that time he'd never said more than was necessary to complete a transaction. He gathered his items, paid in coins, counted out precisely, and turned to leave. That was when he heard the voices outside. Not loud, but carrying the particular tone of men who enjoyed their own cruelty. Sections. Thomas paused at the door, his hand on the frame. Through the dusty window he could see a small crowd gathered near the water trough. 5 or 6 men, townsmen mostly, circled around something he couldn't quite see. Their laughter had an edge to it, the kind that made his jaw tighten. He pushed through the door and stepped into the fading light. The men were gathered around a woman. She sat on the edge of the trough, her head bowed, her hands folded in her lap. She wore a black dress that had seen better days, the fabric faded and dusty from travel. Her hair was dark and pulled back severely from her face. She was small, slight, and she held herself with a stillness that reminded Thomas of a cornered animal that had learned not to run. Paragraph 4. One of the men, a rancher named Dalton, who owned half the county and acted like he owned the rest, while he was speaking loud enough for the whole street to hear. Sections. She just got off the stage, he said, grinning at his companions. Came all the way from Mexico looking for work, but I don't think we got much use for her kind here. Do we, boys? Par. The other men laughed. One of them, a younger man with a cruel mouth, leaned closer to the woman. Parfait, you speak English, senorita. You understand what we're saying. Parvati. The woman lifted her head slightly. Her face was beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with youth or softness. High cheekbones, dark eyes that held no tears, a mouth set in a line of quiet endurance. She looked at the young man for a long moment, then looked away without answering. Sections. Dalton laughed again. I think she understands just fine. She just don't have nothing to say worth hearing. Sections. Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest. He set his supplies down carefully on the store's porch and walked toward the group. His boots made no sound in the dust. The men didn't notice him until he was standing at the edge of their circle. That's enough, Thomas said. Thought. His voice was quiet, but it carried. The laughter stopped. Dalton turned, his grin fading when he saw who had spoken. Well now, Garrett, Dalton said, recovering his smile. Didn't see you there. We're just having a bit of fun with the new arrival. No harm meant. Thomas looked at the woman. She was watching him now, her dark eyes steady and unreadable. There was no plea in them, no hope, just assessment. She looking for work? Thomas asked. Dalton shrugged. Says she can cook and clean. But hell, Garrett, you know how it is. Can't just let any stranger wander into town and expect. Sections 1 and 2. I need a cook, Thomas said. He hadn't planned to say it. The words came out of their own accord, driven by something he didn't want to examine too closely. I'll take her. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to pause. Dalton's smile vanished entirely. Puff, you serious? But Thomas didn't answer. He looked at the woman and spoke directly to her for the first time. You want work? I got work. Room and board, fair wage. It's a day's ride from here. You'd have your own space, your choice. The woman stared at him. For a long moment, she didn't move, didn't speak. Then, slowly, she stood. She was shorter than he'd expected, barely reaching his shoulder. She looked up at him, searching his face for something. Whatever she saw there, it must have been enough. Pio. She nodded once. Pio. Thomas turned to Dalton. She's with me. We got a problem? Pierre Dalton's face darkened, but he stepped back. He knew Thomas Garrett's reputation, knew the man didn't bluff and didn't back down. After a moment, Dalton forced a laugh. No problem, Garrett. You want to take on a Mexican widow. That's your business. Just don't come crying when she robs you blind. Sections, Thomas ignored him. He walked back to the store, retrieved his supplies, and loaded them onto his horse. The woman stood where he'd left her, her hands still folded, her small bundle of possessions at her feet. Thomas tied his supplies down, then looked at her. Parr, you got a horse? Parr, she shook her head. Parr. Thomas considered this, then swung up into the saddle and extended his hand down to her. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. Her hand was small and calloused, strong despite its size. He pulled her up behind him with an ease that surprised them both. She settled onto the horse's back, her bundle clutched against her chest, her body careful not to touch his more than necessary. Before. Thomas turned the horse toward home without another word to the men watching from the street. As they rode out of town, he could feel the weight of her presence behind him, the slight shift of her body as the horse moved beneath them. She didn't speak. Neither did he. The silence between them was complete, broken only by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the whisper of wind through dry grass. Sections, they rode through the gathering dusk, the landscape opening up around them in shades of purple and gray. The land here was hard country, all rock and scrub and distances that could break a man's heart. Thomas had been born to it, raised on it, and it had taken everything from him. His father first, crushed under a horse when Thomas was 16. Then his mother, worn down by work and grief, gone before Thomas turned 20. He'd been alone on this land for nearly 2 decades, and he'd made his peace with that, or thought he had. Parabarf, the woman behind him, shifted slightly, adjusting her grip on her bundle. Thomas could smell wood smoke in her hair, and something else. Cinnamon, maybe, or some spice he didn't have a name for. It was the first time in years that another person had been this close to him. Sections. They reached the ranch as full dark settled over the land. The house was a simple structure, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, he built by his father's hands from timber, hauled 20 miles. Thomas had maintained it with the same grim efficiency he applied to everything else in his life. It was sound, weatherproof, and utterly without comfort. A place to sleep and eat and nothing more. Paraffer, he dismounted and helped the woman down. She stood in the yard, looking at the dark shape of the house, the barn beyond it, the empty corrals. Her face revealed nothing. Thomas lit a lantern and led her inside. The main room held a table, 2 chairs, a stove, and a narrow bed against the far wall. The second room, barely more than a closet, had been his parents' room once. It was empty now except for a bed frame and a trunk. Paraguar. "That's yours," Thomas said, nodding toward the smaller room. "I'll sleep out here. There's a lock on the inside of your door. Use it if you want. These sections." The woman looked at the room, then at him. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Instead, she nodded, that same single careful gesture she'd made in town. But Thomas set the lantern on the table. "I'll bring in your things. There's water in the pitcher. I'll show you the rest in the morning." Sections. He went back outside, unsaddled the horse, and put it up for the night. When he returned to the house, the door to the small room was closed. He could see lamplight under the door, a thin line of gold against the rough floorboards. Prafor. Thomas sat at the table in the dark and wondered what the hell he'd just done. Prafor. He woke before dawn, as he always did, to find a plate of food on the table that hadn't been there when he'd finally fallen asleep in the chair. Tortillas, still warm, wrapped around beans and some kind of meat he didn't recognize. The smell alone made his stomach clench with hunger. He ate standing up, too surprised to sit, and the food was better than anything he'd tasted in years. Maybe ever. When he stepped outside, the woman was already in the yard, drawing water from the well. She'd changed her black dress for a simpler one, dark blue with embroidered flowers at the collar. Her hair was still pulled back, but a few strands had escaped to frame her face. She looked up when she heard his boots on the porch, then returned to her work without speaking. Sections. Thomas watched her for a moment, then went about his own morning routine. He fed the horses, checked the fences, and started the day's work. When he came back to the house at midday, there was food waiting again. Some beans and rice and fresh tortillas and some kind of sauce that made his eyes water and his mouth sing. He ate alone. The woman was nowhere to be seen. Parafor. This pattern continued for days. She cooked, cleaned, and moved through the house and yard like a ghost. He worked from dawn until dark, spoke only when necessary, and tried not to think about the fact that his empty house now smelled like spices and wood smoke and something indefinably alive. Sections. A week passed before he saw her do anything beyond the basic tasks of cooking and cleaning. He was mending a fence line behind the house when he noticed her kneeling in the dirt near the back wall. She had a small knife and was digging in the hard earth with methodical precision. When he walked closer, he saw she'd cleared a patch of ground about 6 feet square, pulling weeds and rocks and smoothing the soil. Sections. Thomas stood watching her work. She didn't acknowledge his presence, but he knew she was aware of him. Her movements had that careful quality of someone being observed. "Parker of making a garden?" he asked. She paused, her hands still in the dirt, then nodded without looking up. Thomas considered this. The ground here was poor, the water scarce. Nothing much grew except scrub brush and heartbreak, but he didn't say that. "I'll bring you some tools," he said instead. Sections. The next morning he left a spade and a hoe leaning against the back wall of the house. When he came in from the fields that evening, the patch had doubled in size, and she'd started marking out rows with bits of string. He stood on the porch and watched her work in the fading light, her movements efficient and sure, and felt something shift in his chest that he couldn't name. Sections. 2 weeks after she'd arrived, Thomas came in from the barn to find his shirt, the one with the torn elbow, lying folded on his chair. He picked it up and examined it. The tear was gone, replaced by stitches so small and neat they were almost invisible. He looked toward the closed door of her room, then set the shirt down carefully and went back outside. Parv. The next day he rode to the far creek and found a flat, smooth stone, perfect for grinding. He left it on the kitchen counter without a word. When he returned that evening, the stone was gone, and the house smelled of herbs and chili and something sweet baking in the oven. Parv. They were learning each other's language, he realized. Not English or Spanish, but the language of gestures and offerings, of small kindnesses exchanged in silence. Sections 3 weeks in, Thomas came back from checking the north pasture to find her standing in the yard with his horse. The animal, a temperamental mare that barely tolerated Thomas himself, was nuzzling the woman's hand with obvious affection. The woman was speaking to the horse in Spanish, her voice soft and musical, and the mare's ears were pricked forward, listening. Bro. Thomas stopped and stared. He'd had that horse for 4 years, and she'd never shown affection to anyone. The woman looked up and saw him watching. For the first time since she'd arrived, something like a smile touched the corners of her mouth. She said something in Spanish to the horse, patted its neck, and walked back toward the house. Partner. Thomas stood in the yard for a long time after she'd gone inside, watching the mare, who was still looking in the direction the woman had walked. 4. That night there was a storm. Not rain, the sky was too stubborn for that, but wind that howled around the house like something alive and hungry. Thomas sat at the table, trying to read by lamplight, but the wind made the flame jump and flicker. He was about to give up and go to bed when the door to the small room opened. Pagor. The woman stood in the doorway, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked at him, then at the stove, then back at him. She said something in Spanish, a question by the tone of it. Pagor. Thomas shook his head. I don't understand. Pagor. She tried again. Slower this time, but it was no use. Finally, she crossed to the stove and pointed at it, then made a gesture like drinking from a cup. Paragraph tea? Thomas asked. Paragraph. She nodded, relief crossing her face, in sections. Thomas stood and went to the stove, suddenly aware of how small the room was, with both of them in it. He put water on to boil while she settled into the other chair at the table. The wind screamed outside, and the lamp cast jumping shadows on the walls. Pour. When the water was ready, Thomas poured 2 cups and sat down across from her. She wrapped her hands around the cup and breathed in the steam. In the lamplight, her face looked younger, softer. He realized he had no idea how old she was. 30, maybe. Or 25, or 40. Her face held too much sorrow to read clearly. Chaparral. They sat in silence, drinking tea while the storm raged. The quiet between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was full, weighted with things neither of them had words for. Chaparral. After a while, the woman set down her cup and looked at him directly. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet, he almost didn't hear it over the wind. Far. Thank you. Far. The words were in English, careful and precise. Thomas felt something in his chest crack open. But for us, you don't need to thank me, he said. But she shook her head slowly. Yes, I do. They sat together until the wind died down, until the lamp oil ran low, until the silence was the only sound left in the world. When she finally stood to return to her room, she paused at the door and looked back at him. Par. My name, she said softly, is Esperanza. Par to Thomas, he replied. Thomas Garrett. Par. She nodded once, then closed the door behind her. Thomas sat alone in the dark and realized he was smiling for the first time in years. Paitrao. The next morning he found her in the garden, which had somehow transformed from bare dirt into organized rows of green shoots. He had no idea what she'd planted or where she'd gotten the seeds, but life was emerging from ground he'd thought was dead. Pebrar. She looked up when she heard him approach, dirt on her hands and that almost smile on her face. "How'd you do this?" he asked, gesturing at the garden. Por. Esperanza stood and brushed the dirt from her skirt. She said something in Spanish, then paused, searching for English words. "Water," she said finally. "Morning. Night." She made a gesture like pouring, every day. Bar. Thomas looked at the well, then at the garden, calculating the distance and the effort. She'd been carrying water, bucket by bucket, in the dark before he woke and after he slept. "For I can help," he said. "I can run a line from the well. Sections." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something in her eyes that might have been gratitude, or might have been something deeper. "Per favor, gracias," she said softly. Then, carefully, "Thank you." Porty, over the next few days, Thomas rigged a simple irrigation system, diverting water from the well to the garden. It was rough work, practical rather than elegant, but it functioned. Esperanza watched him work with an intensity that made him self-conscious. When he finished, she walked the length of the channels, testing the flow, then turned to him and spoke in rapid Spanish. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Approval, pleasure, maybe even joy. That evening she cooked a feast. Chicken in a dark, rich sauce that made his mouth burn and his eyes water and his whole body feel alive. Fresh tortillas, in beans cooked with herbs he couldn't identify, a salad made from greens she'd foraged from somewhere, and for dessert, sweet fried dough dusted with sugar and cinnamon. Part of Thomas ate until he thought he might burst, and when he finally pushed back from the table, he found Esperanza watching him with something like amusement in her eyes. "Par, good," she asked. "Par." He couldn't find words big enough, so he just nodded. "Par." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her entire face, and Thomas felt the last wall around his heart crack just a little bit wider. Polorno. A month passed. Then another. The garden flourished. The house, which had been merely functional for so long, began to show signs of life. Esperanza found wild flowers by the creek and placed them in a tin cup on the table. She organized his tools, mended everything that was torn, and scrubbed the floors until they gleamed. She sang while she worked, soft Spanish songs that drifted through the house like smoke, and Thomas found himself inventing reasons to stay close enough to hear. Sections. They began to talk, haltingly at first, in a mixture of English and Spanish and gesture. Her English improved rapidly. His Spanish remained terrible, but she laughed at his attempts, and her laughter was worth the embarrassment. Purr. He learned that she'd been married young, that her husband had died 3 years ago of fever, that she'd left Mexico because there was nothing left for her there. No family, no money, no future. She'd come north looking for work, any work, willing to do anything to survive. "Sections, I am not worth much," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Her English was still careful, each word chosen precisely. "I have no money, no family, no education, just my hands." Sections. Thomas looked at those hands, small and strong and scarred from labor. He thought about the garden she'd conjured from dead earth, the food that had brought warmth back into his cold house, the shirts mended with invisible stitches, the way his horse followed her around the yard, like a devoted dog. "You're wrong," he said quietly. She looked at him, surprise in her eyes. "You're worth more than you know," he continued. "More than anyone in that town could see. More than you see yourself." Her Esperanza stared at him for a long moment, and he saw tears gathering in her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely and looked away. "Picha favor." "You are kind," she said, "but kind men are rare." "Picha favor." Thomas wanted to say more. He wanted to tell her that kindness had nothing to do with it, that she had become essential to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. But the words wouldn't come, so he sat beside her in silence as the sky turned from gold to purple to black. It was 2 months to the day after she'd arrived when Dalton came. Thomas was working in the barn when he heard the horses. 3 riders coming up the road at an easy pace. He stepped out into the yard, his hand automatically moving to the rifle he kept by the door. Perforce Dalton sat his horse like a king surveying his domain. The 2 men with him were ranch hands, big and mean-looking, the kind Dalton kept around for the jobs that required muscle over brains. "Dwarf Garrett," Dalton said, touching the brim of his hat in mock courtesy. "Been meaning to ride out and see how you're getting on. These sections." Thomas said nothing. He could see Esperanza through the window of the house, standing very still, watching. "Sections." Dalton followed his gaze and smiled. "That Mexican woman's still here. Surprised she hasn't robbed you and run off yet." "State your business, Dalton," Thomas said flatly. Dalton's smile widened. "Well now, that's the thing. Turns out I got business with your little señorita. See, I've been doing some asking around, and it seems she came across the border without proper papers. No documentation, no sponsor, nothing legal about her presence here at all." "Sections," Thomas felt ice forming in his gut. "Sections. Now, I'm a law-abiding citizen," Dalton continued. "Can't just ignore something like that. I've sent word to the territorial marshal. He'll be here in a few days to sort this out. Likely, she'll be deported, sent back where she came from. Unless, of course, someone was willing to take responsibility for her. Someone with standing in the community. Sections." The implication was clear. Dalton wanted something, and Esperanza was the leverage. "Sections. What do you want?" Thomas asked. "Sections." Dalton leaned forward in his saddle. "That creek that runs through your north pasture. I need access to it. My herd's growing, and I need the water rights. You give me easement, permanent and legal, and I'll make sure the marshal understands that your little Mexican is actually your housekeeper, legal and proper." Sections. Thomas looked at the creek Dalton was talking about. It was the only reliable water source on his property, the reason the ranch could survive at all. Without it, he'd have to sell within a year. "Fro. And if I refuse?" "Parvo." Dalton shrugged. "Then the marshal does his job. She gets sent back to Mexico. Probably ends up in a detention camp for a few months first. You know how those places are. Rough conditions. A lot of women don't survive them." Thomas felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous. His hand tightened on the rifle. "Parar." "I'd think carefully before doing anything stupid, Garrett," Dalton said, his voice hardening. "You're one man. I've got the law on my side and half the county in my pocket. You can't win this." Sections. Thomas looked past Dalton to the house. Esperanza had moved to the doorway. She stood framed in the entrance, her hands at her sides, her face calm. She shook her head slowly. A warning, or maybe a plea. "Sections, I'll need time to think," Thomas said. "Sections." Dalton smiled. You got 3 days. Marshall arrives on Thursday. You bring me those papers by Wednesday sundown, or she's gone. Sections. He turned his horse and rode off, his men following. Thomas stood in the yard until the dust settled, then walked slowly to the house. Paragraph Esperanza was waiting inside. She looked at him with eyes that held no hope, only resignation. Sections, he will take me, she said quietly. Is okay. You cannot fight him. Sections. Thomas shook his head. I'm not giving you up. Sections. She stepped closer, her small hand reaching out to touch his arm. Thomas, she said, and hearing his name in her voice made his chest ache. Thomas, you will lose everything. The water, the ranch, maybe your life. I am not worth this. Borrow. He caught her hand in his, holding it gently but firmly. You keep saying that you're not worth much, not worth fighting for, but you're wrong. Sections. She tried to pull away, but he held on, his other hand coming up to cup her face. She froze, her eyes wide. Sections. You brought life back to dead ground, Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion he'd kept buried for years. You brought warmth to a cold house. You made me remember what it feels like to have something worth protecting. You think that's not worth fighting for? Petra 4. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I do not want you to lose everything because of me. Perpstidav Matsai already lost everything once, he said. My parents, my future, any hope of having a family. I've been dead inside for 20 years, just going through the motions. Then you showed up and I started living again. You think I'm going to let Dalton take that away? Perkar. What will you do? She whispered. Pear. Thomas released her and stepped back, his mind already working through possibilities. I don't know yet, but I've got 3 days to figure it out. Parkerau. That night he rode into town, leaving Esperanza with the rifle and instructions to bar the door. He went to the only lawyer in the territory, an old man named Morrison, who'd been practicing law since before Texas was a state. Morrison listened to Thomas's story, asked a few pointed questions, and then leaned back in his chair. Sections, Dalton's bluffing, Morrison said. Partially, anyway. Yes, she probably doesn't have papers. Most folks crossing the border don't. But there's no law saying you can't employ someone without documentation. Not yet, anyway. The territorial marshal might ask questions, but he can't deport her without a formal hearing, and those take months to arrange. Sections. So Dalton can't touch her? In sections. Morrison shook his head. I didn't say that. Dalton's got connections. He could make life very difficult for both of you. Harassment, legal challenges, pressure on your suppliers. He's a patient man when he wants something. Sections. Thomas felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders. What are my options? Sections. Morrison studied him for a long moment. There is one way to make her legal status unquestionable. Marry her. A man's wife can't be deported without deporting him too, and you're a citizen. It would give her full legal protection. Sections. Thomas stared at him. Marriage. Sections. It's just a legal arrangement, Morrison said. Doesn't have to mean anything beyond the paperwork. Though I suspect, Garrett, it might mean more to you than you're admitting. Sections. Thomas rode home through the dark, Morrison's words echoing in his head. When he arrived, Esperanza was waiting on the porch, the rifle across her lap. She stood when she saw him, relief flooding her face. Parer, you are safe, she said. Bart, I'm fine. We need to talk. They sat at the kitchen table, the lamp burning low between them. Thomas explained what Morrison had said, laying out the options with the same careful precision he used for everything. When he got to the part about marriage, Esperanza's eyes widened. "Per favor, you would do this?" she asked. "Marry me to protect me." "Per favor." "If you're willing," Thomas said, "it would be legal, binding. But it doesn't have to be." He struggled for the right words. "It doesn't have to be real if you don't want it to be. It can just be papers. Protection." Partfart Esperanza looked down at her hands, folded on the table. "And if I want it to be real?" she asked quietly. "Perfectity." Thomas felt his heart stop, then start again, faster. "What, Partfart?" She looked up at him, her dark eyes steady. "You say I brought life to your house, but you brought life to me too. You are the first man who see me, Thomas. Not a servant, not a burden, not a thing to use. You see me." Partfart, she reached across the table and took his hand. "I was dead too," she said. "My husband, he was not kind. I was alone in a country that did not want me. I thought I would die in that town, that no one would care. Then you came. You defended me. You gave me work. You gave me respect. You gave me a home. Au revoir." Her grip tightened. "If you ask me to marry you, I say yes. Not because I need papers, because I want to stay. With you. Here, if you want me." Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He pulled her up and into his arms, then holding her against his chest like she might disappear if he let go. She wrapped her arms around him and pressed her face against his shoulder. "For I want you," he said into her hair. "God help me. I've wanted you since the day I saw you sitting by that water trough, refusing to cry. I just didn't know how to say it." "Born." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, and he saw joy in her face, bright and unmistakable. "Then you do not need words," she said. "Just ask me." For Thomas took her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears on her cheeks. "Esperanza, will you marry me? Not for papers, not for protection, because I love you, because I want to build a life with you, because you're worth everything." Per favor. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Thomas. Yes, per favor." He kissed her then, softly at first, then deeper, tasting salt and sweetness and the promise of a future he'd thought was lost forever. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were shaking. "P.R. We'll do it tomorrow," Thomas said. "Morrison can file the papers. We'll be married before Dalton even knows what happened." Perforce Esperanza smiled, and it was like the sun coming up. "Then we tell him together," she said. "You and me, as husband and wife. Sections." The next day they rode to town together, Esperanza sitting behind Thomas on the horse, her arms wrapped around his waist. Morrison had the papers ready. They signed them in his dusty office with Morrison and his clerk as witnesses. It took less than 10 minutes to become husband and wife in the eyes of the law. Sections. But that night, back at the ranch, they made it real. Thomas took Esperanza's hand and led her to the small room that had been hers, where he'd moved his things that afternoon. They stood together in the lamplight, and he saw that she'd placed wildflowers on the windowsill and arranged their few possessions with care. "Pas fort." "Our room," she said softly. "Pas fort." "Our room," he agreed. "Pas fort." She reached up and touched his face, tracing the lines that years of sun and sorrow had carved there. "You are a good man, Thomas Garrett," she said. "I will spend my life proving you are right about me." Pas. He caught her hand and kissed her palm. "You already have." On Wednesday, an hour before sundown, Thomas and Esperanza rode to Dalton's ranch. They found him on the porch, smoking a cigar and looking pleased with himself. His expression changed when he saw them approach together. "Pierre Garrett," he said, standing. "I wasn't expecting you to bring her along. You got those papers?" Pierre. Thomas dismounted and helped Esperanza down. They stood together, her hand in his. "Pio, I got papers," Thomas said. "Just not the ones you wanted. Sections." He pulled the marriage certificate from his pocket and handed it to Dalton. Dalton read it, his face darkening with every word. "P. You married her," he said flatly. "P. Yesterday," Thomas confirmed, "which means she's a legal resident now. Can't be deported, can't be touched, and I don't need to give you a damn thing." Sections. Dalton crumpled the paper in his fist. "You think this changes anything? You think marrying some Mexican whore makes you better than me?" Sections. Thomas moved before he could think, his fist connecting with Dalton's jaw with a crack that echoed across the yard. Dalton went down hard, blood streaming from his split lip. Sections. "You don't talk about my wife that way," Thomas said quietly. "You don't talk about her at all. You come near her. You come near my ranch. You even think about causing trouble, and I'll do more than hit you." Dalton's ranch hands had started forward, but Esperanza's voice stopped them cold. "No," she said, her English clear and strong. She stepped forward, standing beside Thomas. "You want to hurt him. You hurt me too. We are together now. You cannot separate us. You cannot scare us. You have no power here." Prav Dalton wiped blood from his mouth, his eyes full of hate. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Thomas said. "It's over. Go find someone else's life to ruin. You're done with ours." Bolero. He took Esperanza's hand, and they walked back to the horse. As they rode away, Thomas felt her arms tighten around him. "Peragao." "You hit him," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "Peragao, he deserved it." "Peragao." "Yes," she agreed. "He did." "Peragao." The marshal came on Thursday, as promised. He asked a few questions, examined their marriage certificate, looked around the ranch, and left satisfied. Dalton, nursing his bruised jaw and his wounded pride, didn't press the matter. Word spread through the county that Thomas Garrett had married a Mexican woman and knocked Dalton flat for insulting her. Some people muttered. Some people laughed. Thomas didn't care what any of them thought. The seasons turned. Esperanza's garden flourished, producing vegetables that she sold in town, building a reputation for quality that even the suspicious townspeople couldn't deny. She taught Thomas Spanish. He taught her to read English. They worked side by side, building something neither of them had thought possible. Sections a year after their wedding, Thomas came in from the fields to find Esperanza standing in the garden, her hand on her belly, a look of wonder on her face. "Prepor, Thomas," she said. Prepor. He knew before she said it. He crossed the yard in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. "A baby," she whispered. "We will have a baby." Farp Thomas held her, this woman who had been worth nothing in the eyes of the world, who had proven to be worth everything. He thought about the day he'd found her by the water trough, silent and resigned. He thought about the courage it had taken for her to accept his offer, to trust a stranger, to build a life from nothing. "Farf, you were wrong," he told her, his voice thick with emotion. "That day, you said you weren't worth much. You were so wrong. Sections." She pulled back to look at him, tears streaming down her face. "And you," she said, "you were right. You saw what no one else could see. You proved I was worth fighting for." "Parfor." "We proved it together," he said. Barbara, they stood in the garden she had made, surrounded by life she had coaxed from dead earth. and Thomas Garrett knew that he was the luckiest man alive. Not because he'd saved her, but because she had saved him. Years later, when their children played in that same garden, and the house rang with laughter and Spanish songs and the smell of Esperanza's cooking, Thomas would sometimes think back to that sunset in the dusty trading post, to the moment he'd heard men laughing at a woman's pain and decided he couldn't walk away. It had been the simplest decision of his life, the best decision of his life, and sections. Because Esperanza had been right about one thing. Kind men were rare, but she had made him want to be one. And in doing so, she had given him everything. Sections, thank you for listening to this story. Sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones the world overlooks, the ones that require us to see with more than just our eyes. Thomas saw Esperanza's worth when no one else would, but in truth, they saved each other. Have you ever had someone believe in you when you couldn't believe in yourself? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Your support means everything and helps us continue sharing these stories. I'll see you in the next one.